Hi students, welcome to the review session for Caribbean Civilization. I trust that you all enjoyed going through the various units throughout the entire semester, and now we have come to the end. So this session is going to be light. It's going to be just a refresher of some of the major points that you have learned throughout the semester, major topics you have covered, part of the ethos of the course as well. As you prepare to submit your final assignment. And we do trust that the content that you would have learned throughout the course you take with you as you move forward. Once again, I'm Akil Murray. I was with you for Unit 7, Religion, Education, and Caribbean Family Life. And it's a pleasure to be with you once again. So, of course, you're going to start with Unit 1 and the concept of civilization. And within this unit, we would have asked particular questions, and those questions would have been answered. And so the first one I have here is, what is the role of the historian? I'll give you a second to think about what you learned in the course. And if perhaps your answer was recovering and interpreting the past for the entire society, then that would have been correct. Even if it was not those exact words, but you were talking about reinterpreting the past, recovering the past, that would also be correct. All right. And so the historian has an important role because just as much as you can go and ask your grandfather or your mother about what happened 25 years ago, when perhaps most of you were not born as yet, uh, they are going to give you a perspective. And you might take that perspective of that particular event 25 years ago, and you might write that down as the history of that particular event. What the historian does is not only does he recover the past as you have done, but he recovers it with a particular skill set, which allows him to understand that this perspective given by your grandmother or your mother is just one perspective of that particular event. And so the historian has to look at the various ways and the holistic nature of that particular event in order to recover a very accurate account of that event, as close as possible to an accurate account of that event. And so that leads to whether his interpretation will be accurate or largely inaccurate. And you all would have looked at that when you looked at revisionism and what would have been said traditionally about Caribbean history from the lens of the European historians, right? You would have debunked myths about indigenous peoples and so forth, because historians in the last 100 years or so, with the relevant skill sets and acknowledging that they have biases and trying to limit those biases, wrote histories or rewrote the histories of the Caribbean peoples and civilizations from a more objective perspective. All right. So yes, the role of a historian, recovering and interpreting the past. Value of a sense of history. What is the value in history? Well, one, it allows us to get information about past societies and ways of life, of people and civilizations. So generally, simply, the historian and having a sense of history helps us to get information. Two, demonstrate the need to always be critical of our sources and to be open to alternate viewpoints and methodologies for appreciating the past. And that is what I just explained before, about realizing, acknowledging that there are many sides to the story, right? You can't just go with one. You have to try as much as you can to get the various sides of the story. A sense of history is important because the past is central to our sense of identity. Who we are as people. Why do we call ourselves West Indians, right? Why is the ethnic makeup of the Caribbean as it is, right? Why are we in this particular position in relation to our socioeconomic position on the global scene as compared to other territories? When it comes to our cultural traits, right? The way we speak, linguistics, all of these things are tied to our history. A sense of history provides us with familiarity with the past. And as I usually tell students, and I'm sure somebody would have told you look to someone who may have gone a particular way, a particular route of life. Let's say a family member, right? They were a lawyer. So you grew up seeing them, operating in that career. And because it's something that you grew up familiar with, you get into that particular profession when you got older, right? Or you felt motivated to lend yourself, your labor towards that particular field of work. A sense of history allows us to validate our current actions and understandings, right? And when you consider why is the demography of the university in terms of age, why do we have so many young people attending university in Trinidad and Tobago in particular? And a simple event that you can point to, historical event that you can point to, will be GATE, access to free tertiary level education, right? That substantially increased the number of students, right, at a young age leaving secondary school and venturing straight into university life. Yeah. And so when we think about leaving secondary school, coming into the university, we don't necessarily think about it. Some of us, unfortunately, and this is not the majority of you, but just some of us think, you know what, this is what my parents want me to do. Let me just get this degree out of the way and move on. I don't know what I want to do with my life as yet. So let me just continue studying for a little bit more. And then perhaps in the 3 years of doing the degree, hopefully by the end of your first year, you know what you want to do. So you might decide to shift your major, etc., etc. Right? So students tend to pinpoint these reasons for attending the university, but never point to the historical event that led to them having the ability, the freedom to make that choice, where their grandparents would not have had that choice to make, or would not have been able to make that choice. A lot of our grandparents would not have been able to make that decision. Yeah, the past is often called upon as a means of guidance. So you have friends who did the course before, and so you lent on them for support. You wanted to find out how they did any book report, if the book that they use is the same book that we're using now, etc., etc., because you are looking for them for guidance so that you can ensure that you pass the course through the semester. Past is often used as an escape route from the pressures and hassles of the present. So as you're approaching that period of exam now, which is, by the time you would have gotten this particular lecture, you're thinking back at the beginning of the semester. You're thinking back in August vacation period. Of course, with the pandemic, you couldn't really go out much. But the fact that you were home and you were relaxing, now you're online and you're stressed with exams in whatever format it is in, coursework assignments. Now you're really worried. All right, so you're looking back at the time when life wasn't that stressful. And our parents do it as well. They look back at their times in terms of when they grew up. They look back at those times and say, no, this was the best time. Children are not the same today as they were back then. We were much more kind, we were much more well-behaved, etc., etc. Because to them, the time frame, the period in which they grew up, it resonates with them to such an extent that they hold on to it and see it as the best times of their life. So of course, it's an escape route from the pressures and hassles of the present. Then you would have defined primary sources and secondary sources. Right? Contemporary source generated during the period of research, that is primary source. Contemporary source generated during the period of research. Secondary source, a work that was developed through primary source material. And of course, you have examples to books, articles, etc. So I'm sure by now you all would have learned how to define primary sources and secondary sources. Sorry if you didn't before you would have sit the MCQ. The myth of prehistory. What is this about? Remember we were saying traditional historians would have looked at civilizations that did not write their livelihoods, right? Did not have a mode of writing. They would have looked at them and referred to them as prehistorical because they did not have documentation. But we acknowledge that all civilizations, whether they wrote or not, were all civilizations worthy of acknowledging their history. Okay, so we refer to them as pre-literate societies, pre-literate civilizations. And of course, we have ways of getting primary material to look at those civilizations, right? We have non-written sources, right? We have oral accounts, oral tradition, oral history that we can use to understand how these civilizations function. And of course, we have archaeology through the excavation of artifacts, right? Skeletal remains and so forth. We glean an understanding of their livelihood. And so they are pre-literate societies, not prehistorical societies. Because to say prehistorical means that they did not have a history. Two primary techniques used by historians: external criticism. What is that? Do you all remember? It's about confirming the authenticity of the document. Confirming the authenticity of the document. External criticism. How could you do that? Looking at the handwriting of the document. If you look at other documents and it says that it was written by, let's say, Christopher Columbus, but you know that there are other documents that have been proven to have actually been written by Christopher Columbus, and he would have signed those documents. You can go to them and look at the signature. And then you can look at this new document that claims to be on a journal of Columbus, and you look for the signature to see if it lines up with the signature of the documents that have already been validated as Columbus's documents. Yeah. So handwriting can tell you if a document is accurate or not, or if any particular primary source is accurate or not, depending on the platform or the mode in which it was created. Chemical composition of the ink and paper as well, right? So the components to make paper and ink would have changed over the course of time. And if a document speaks to a particular period, then you can figure out, research and find out what was the type of ink and the type of paper used in that period of time. And then you'll be able to determine if this is actually accurate. Yeah, that document is actually accurate because the type of paper, the type of ink matches up with the time frame in which this document would have been written. And of course, an internal criticism. After you have externally criticized the document and proven that it is valid, you engage in internal criticism, right? And this is where you criticize the document, right? You are looking at the value in the construction of a historical narrative, right? After external criticism, where you validate the source, internal criticism by the historian now determines its value in the construction of a historical narrative. Okay, so yes, this document was written by Columbus, but Columbus was European. Columbus was a sailor. Columbus was an explorer. Columbus had an agenda. All right. And so once you understand that, when you look at his document, you are going to be looking at that document knowing that he had particular biases in the way that he would have written. He would have written in a way so that he can get more sponsorship for more voyages. Right? He's not going to come to the Caribbean for the first time and say, oh, this place is a waste of time, you know, this is not valuable to us, etc., etc. He had to carry a particular story. so that he could assure himself of future funding for the rest of his expeditions. Then you would have looked at varying civilizations, Paleolithic period. This was characterized by hunting and fishing societies that had to follow their own food, yeah, which was referred to as the hunter-gatherer phase. Then you had the Neolithic period from approximately 2500 BCE, where the art of animal husbandry and plant cultivation were discovered. Resultantly, these groups established villages and expanded their societies. So we switched from Paleolithic to Neolithic, and this was referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. So societies moving from the hunter-gatherer phase, moving from nomadic societies into societies that settled in particular areas because they developed the art of animal husbandry and plant cultivation, right? Enable them to expand, to grow their societies. And so the arts flourished, right? You're not concerned about food every day because you have the animals there in the pens, etc. So you don't have to go searching for food on a regular basis. So now you're more settled, you have more time to express yourself, you have more time to think. And so because of this, right, arts grew, right? The elaborate paintings on pieces of pottery, etc., were allowed to flourish because humans had more time to develop these particular skills, right? Things like music as well also developed as a result of the Neolithic Revolution. Unit 2, defining Caribbean civilization, the indigenous settlers. You would have, of course, defined the physical landscape of the Caribbean, right? What are the islands of the Greater Antilles? Yeah. Which islands make up the Greater Antilles? Of course, you should know. Cuba, the island of Hispaniola, with Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Puerto Rico. Yeah. Major islands of the Greater Antilles. And of course, you have the islands of the Lesser Antilles, right, made up of the Leeward and the Windward Islands that you see listed here, all right, all the way from the Virgin Islands down to Grenada, Trinidad to the south, and Barbados to the east, all right. So of course you would have remembered those definitions of the physical landscape. Let me move on to the lifestyle of the indigenous peoples. And we're talking about division of labor. You all recall the rules. What were some of the rules of the indigenous men as compared to the indigenous women? Were they patriarchal rules? If you look at modern day society and what we consider patriarchal, yes, definitely we can say they were. Men and boys undertook tasks such as clearing the fields, hunting, fishing, defense of the village, house construction, and canoe making, whilst women and girls were in charge of crop cultivation, spinning and weaving, of cotton, making handicrafts, childbearing, and preparing food and drinks. So if you're looking at a topic on gender relations in the Caribbean, of course, from the very onset of the indigenous peoples, first peoples of the Caribbean, you had a particular divide when it came to labor that was heavily gendered. And in a modern day context, we would say it was favoring the male. When we consider from the religious perspective as well, right? Were they monotheistic or polytheistic peoples? Yes, if you said polytheistic, correct, right? But even in these rules of religious leaders, men were the ones at the forefront. Yeah, they were said to have a trinity of gods. Yeah, Zemis, you'll remember that, the miniature representations of their gods, which allow them to transcend the physical world and enter into the spiritual world. Main crops, what were their main crops? Cassava, of course, indigenous word, manioc, potato, and maize, corn. Kunukus. These were the small agricultural plots which were raised. It was just elevated above the ground, where they rested the land for some time, and then they will go back after a few years to grow crops on that kunukus again, right? They were resting the land and going back. Irrigation systems, right? They developed sophisticated irrigation systems for these kunukus. Yeah. Trade. And this again shows the patriarchal nature, yeah, of the indigenous society, with the fact that women were traded, men were not traded in the indigenous civilization, but we have evidence that women were traded, and that trade was generally the domain of men. When men built the canoes and men went out to trade, yeah, they were largely subsistence, but they did engage in surplus farming and therefore engaged in trade, right? And of course, a pidgin developed amongst the men as a result of that. They spoke a particular dialect, an additional dialect, because of their need to communicate with other tribes. Politics, of course, as mentioned before, patriarchal, the cacique was largely the leader. And he had a religious, political, and judicial function in the society. Male cacique position was largely hereditary. And so as a result of that, at times you had a female who would rise to the cacique. And this would have been largely the case if no male heirs were available for some reason or the other. Estimated 6 million new Indians at the time of European arrival and settlement. Their numbers decreased significantly as a result of these three factors, which you must never forget: miscegenation, the encomienda system, and European diseases. What is miscegenation again? I hope you remember. Right? Interbreeding, if you could call it that, sexual relations between Europeans and indigenous women. Right? The idea was that you would create loyal subjects to Spain in the Caribbean by having sexual relations and reproducing with the indigenous women. The encomienda system and the rigors of that system, taking indigenous peoples, making them work in the mines to extract gold, making them work on your provision grounds to grow crops and to provide for you, overworking them as a result of that, not giving them time to work on their own provision grounds. Many of them died of overwork. Many of them died of malnutrition as a result of the hours that they had to work under the encomienda system, which was said to have a priest attached to it to convert the indigenous peoples as they worked. And of course, European diseases. They were exposed to these diseases, very vulnerable to them because they were never exposed to them before, resulting in the death of a number of indigenous peoples. Move on to Unit 3, the diversified Caribbean in the 16th and 17th centuries. You had popular ideologies that existed at the time that encouraged European expansion and motivated Columbus and others to venture into this quote-unquote new world, because it was new to them, not new to indigenous peoples, right? Bullionism, the idea that the resources of gold and silver around the world are finite, and that if you can get hold of all of these resources, you will be the most powerful nation in the world. All right. So the New World offered an opportunity for European powers to garner as much bullion as they can, so that they could rule Europe and, by extension, in their mind, rule the rest of the world. All right. Colonialism, which involves formal political control, annexing a territory, so that territory, the people living in that territory, loses their sovereignty. They are now under the political control of another entity, a foreign entity that has come in. And that control is usually achieved by military means, right? Intimidation, if not outright war, plundering and killing, military intimidation, right? I have superior weapons, I have more soldiers. And so in that sense, people give over and say, okay, we give up this land to you, and we give up our will to you as well. Mercantilism, the idea of exclusivity of trade, land and trade. So crops or commodities must be shipped by Spanish ships to the Spanish colonies. And then raw material from the Spanish colonies are taken back on Spanish ships to Spain before re-exportation to anywhere in the world. So mercantilism, right, also provided an opportunity. Well, the New World, also provided an opportunity for mercantilism to flourish, because now these European powers are saying we can gain new lands, new colonies, and these colonies can produce raw materials for us, and then we can benefit from them. And there's the argument that Caribbean society is still made up in some way with this design, this dynamic taking place. Yeah. And of course, colonialism offered the same thing, the same opportunity for them to take control of new territories and religion. The idea that there was a need within Christianity, and still there, very present. It is at the core of the faith that you need to tell others about Christ, the Great Commission of Jesus Christ, right? After he died and resurrected, what did he tell his disciples? For those of you who are Christians and should know. Go ye therefore and preach to all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So within the psyche, the mind of the Europeans, their motivation for entering into the New World was also an opportunity to gain new lands for Christ, for Christianity, and claim new peoples for Christianity. And you see this in the names that were given to many of the islands by the European settlers, by Columbus, for example. Right? San Salvador, speaking about salvation, Trinidad, Trinity, etc., etc. Right? Very Christian names. Saint Vincent, Saint Kitts, yeah, all names coming from the legacy of Christianity, which we inherited in the region from European expansion. What were the indigenous names of some of these islands? Right? Something that we should look into. Haiti, or Haiti, if you're speaking it in French, right, has the original name of the indigenous peoples. Right? What was Trinidad called by the indigenous groups? Many claim Airi, yeah, land of the hummingbird. Right? So we have original names that were given to some of these territories by the indigenous peoples living here. But Christianity, the idea of claiming lands for Christ, changed the names of many islands. I think Dominica was called Waitukibuli, right? Pretty difficult to pronounce. So Waitukibuli, wide is our body, I believe was the interpretation in English, and referring to the mountains of Dominica and how big and wide it was. Yes, then you had the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, which I believe you would have touched on as well. So Spain, through this treaty by Pope Alexander VI, claimed everything to the west of the line, and everything to the east of that revised line, the darker line, was given to Portugal. And we'll see that the line goes to Brazil. And when we look at the first language of Brazil, we know that it's Portuguese, whilst the rest of Latin America speaks Spanish, right? So part of the legacy of the linguistic makeup of Central and South America comes from the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, right? And that legacy that is attached to it. But more than that, in relation to the treaty, the other European powers decided that they are going to ignore this treaty and they are going to come into the Caribbean and battle. Battle for power, battle for land, battle for resources, so that they could empower and strengthen the fight in Europe, so that they will become the most dominant power in Europe. And so the Caribbean space became a cockpit for leadership, for power in Europe. And this is where we get the term, the cockpit of Europe. How did they battle? Buccaneering and privateering. Do you remember what a buccaneer does, what a privateer does. A buccaneer, different. The buccaneer works for any government, any crown that offers him money to do work for them. So it could have been the French, could have been the Dutch, could have been the British, would have offered a buccaneer money or part of or resources to plunder Spanish ships carrying through the system of mercantilism, with their convoys carrying the gold that they would have gotten from the larger islands in the Greater Antilles, or primarily the gold that they would have gotten from Central America. And these crowns hire these buccaneers to intercept their ships, plunder, take their wealth, and carry it back, and giving them a portion, of course. The privateers usually work for particular state agencies, particular crowns, all right? And we have many of them, Hawkins, John Hawkins, etc. Popular privateers that operated. Piracy, we usually say that they worked on their own accord, right? But they were all pirates in a sense, right? But just state-sanctioned piracy. But if we just use it in pirate, we tend to connote that these persons were operating on their own accord, right? And taking all of the wealth that they receive for themselves. So this is how they were interloping. This is how they were undermining Spain's dominance in the New World. Illegal trade as well. So many of the islands that were actually occupied by the Spanish, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, they neglected these islands because they were more concerned of the bullion that they were getting from Central America. So the French and the British, etc., and the Dutch came in and provided Spanish settlers on these colonies with goods when they were neglected by the Spanish Empire. So again, they were undermining the system of mercantilism, which teaches them, or teaches societies to not engage with trade outside, right, at particular points. And of course, the policy of effective occupation. The other European powers decided that we are going to take control of islands that are not occupied by the Spanish. And when we look at the Leeward Islands, when we look at the Windward Islands, we see that impact. Largely British-speaking islands with British culture, or French-speaking islands with French culture. And that, of course, is linked to bullionism, the fact that smaller islands had no mineral, not that type of mineral, gold and silver and so forth. And so as a result of that, the Spanish were not interested, right? And so the heritage of the Caribbean is made up in such a way because of that policy of effective occupation. Of course, there were attempts to diversify. You had the growing of various crops, tobacco and cotton in the English colonies of St. Kitts and Barbados. These goods were never able to have a great market value and to bring any significant revenue. Tobacco was successful for some time, but lost out due to competition from Virginia. I'm sure you all remember those discussions. You had attempts to also grow cocoa in Trinidad, and it was good for some time, up until 1725, when diseases really killed the cocoa industry in Trinidad. These crops were largely grown by the encomienda system and white indentured labor. Yes, remember white indentured labor. And then you had the emergence of sugar in the British West Indies, firstly on the island of Barbados, 1640. Yeah? And we understand how sugar changed the Caribbean region, changed the dynamic, changed the demographics, changed the economy of the Caribbean region. We're moving from attempts to diversify, experimenting with different crops, to focusing on this cash crop, king sugar, which created monocrop culture in the Caribbean, focusing on one crop to produce all the revenue for the island. And what it also did was changing demographics, making the African descended population the largest group in the society because sugar was very labor intensive. And so you had to have a large labor force. Yeah. And those white planters who had various estates, cocoa estates, cotton estates, tobacco estates, cocoa estates, etc., sold their estates off to the sugar planters and returned. So you had a dwindling of the number of whites in some of these Caribbean islands as a result. Yeah. And of course, the middle group, based on the society, slave society being based on color, the middle group will be made up of some poor whites who are merchants, shopkeepers, and colored people who are free and progressing in these various societies. Yeah. So this was the social system, social pyramid that was created by King Sugar. Unit 4, Beyond the Rivers of Babylon, Enslavement and Freedom of West Africans. A very good unit that you would have gone through, and you would have looked at comparing West African slavery to chattel slavery. You all remember some of the differences between West African slavery and chattel slavery, right? The humanity of the slave was acknowledged in West African slavery, whereas the chattel slave was commodity, was property. He was not seen as human. Let me ask a question. Was it customary for West African slaves to have children born into slavery? Yeah, was it customary for West Africans to have slaves born into slavery? And if your answer is no, then you will be correct. But in chattel slavery, this was the case. If you were born to enslave an enslaved mother, you were a slave by birth, right? And this was not largely the case across West African societies. In fact, you all would have touched on the fact that some observers of West African slavery could not even tell the difference between who was a slave and who was the owner, right? Who was the master, because they were so interwoven within the society that they were part of the economic system, so much part of the economic system that they weren't separated culturally, socially, right, from their masters. And some of them, of course, were highly valued for their skills, unlike chattel slavery, where it was about mass number of people to do a particular task, unless you were working in the factory, etc., or came with particular skills or developed particular skills to work away from the plantation. You were simply seen as a laborer to a large extent in the Caribbean. And so your value was also diminished as a result. Right? And so you have gone through some of these differences between West African slavery and chattel slavery. Right? You could be sold into slavery, you could put yourself into slavery to pay off a debt. Right? And this was not the case with chattel slavery. Islamization of slavery in West Africa. From 7th century AD, as slavery spread, as Islam spread across West Africa, you had a codification taking place with the slave systems, because as Islam spread, persons started to look to the Quran and the teachings on how you ought to treat your slave, right? How you ought to treat a slave. And that became sort of a uniform way of approaching slavery in West Africa. Right? So this improved the living conditions, it ameliorated the living conditions of enslaved persons in West Africa. But if you're looking at the negative side, and some of the negative experiences of slavery in West Africa, right? Because it was not all, bed with roses, etc. You can say that it also legitimized the system more, right? A system that was in some ways exploitative. Benefits of utilizing West African slavery. Why did they choose to use West Africans? Right? Not just because the indigenous peoples are dying out that they decided to go West Africans. Right? They tried white indentured labor, that wasn't working. Right? Why didn't they go to China? No, they turned to West Africa, and this is because it provided a labor force that was tractable, easy to manipulate, essentially, easy to maneuver, easy to control, because they had no weaponry. They tried to separate them. Like if they took from a particular tribe, they would try to separate them to ensure that you don't have a huge group of persons from the same tribe where they could be able to communicate with each other, plan revolts, etc. And many times, recruiters, slave owners, and planters will have correspondences with each other about, ensuring that they don't take persons from particular tribes because they were given to committing suicide or given to being rebellious. Yeah, relatively immune to new world diseases. This was a huge benefit, bearing in mind that white indentured labor failed as a result of the inability of whites to deal with these diseases, Europeans to deal with diseases in the Western world, had a low transport cost. Of course, West Africa was much closer to the Caribbean than Europe, was much closer to the Caribbean than China and any other place to the east. Had a low purchase price, and sometimes slave traders would hike up the price sometimes 3-4 times, and of course even at higher levels when they purchase enslaved persons on the West African coast. Of course, sometimes they would trade them for commodities that were dispensable in Europe, pots, pans, right? Sometimes more lucrative items, guns, gunpowder, ammunition, etc. Move to gender and enslavement. Of course, we could recall during the enslavement experience, women dominated domestic arena, even though men also worked in the domestic arena. Women were also heavily involved in the field work, particularly beyond the period of the abolition of the slave trade, when you can't control the labor that is produced to the estate, because the labor that is now coming from the estate comes from the reproduction on the estates. And so you can't control whether an enslaved woman is going to make a boy child or a girl child. So women were always a huge factor in production on the fields as well, even though they dominated the domestic arena. Men dominated the skill sector, right? Factory work outside the plantation as skilled workers. Men dominated that. Remember the first gangs, age 18, mid-30s, right? In terms of just the breakdown of work. You had the second gang over 45 years of age doing slightly lighter tasks than the first gang. And of course, the third gang, little children and the elderly. And in these gangs, you had women who were drivers at times, right, of the little children, making them pick weeds, gather the cane trash, etc. So women did have some role as drivers on the third gangs for the little children and the elderly. Manumission. What is it? Do you all remember what manumission is? And I'm hoping you say legal freedom from enslavement. And if you said that, you are correct. Manumission is legal freedom from enslavement. So if you run away from a plantation and you go and live in the bushes as a maroon for years, you're not free. You're not manumitted, sorry, you're free. You freed yourself, but you're not manumitted. So if they caught you after years and decided to bring you back to the plantation, they had all rights under their laws to do so. Manumission is legal freedom. And what were some of those reasons for granting manumission? You all remember? Revealing plans for revolts, as you will call snitching. Sexual favors granted, so women use their sexuality at times, making use of the circumstance, because resistance would have meant what? Right? Brutality, beatings, killings. Right? So women sometimes are granted manumission because of sexual favors. Long and meritorious service. So you never rebelled, right? You worked particularly hard, and when you were old, right, and you could no longer provide any valuable labor, they freed you. But we must remember the process of freeing an enslaved person, manumitting an enslaved person, was not an easy one. And it occurred at various levels in the various territories, whether it was Spanish, whether it was British, yeah, or whether it was the French. There were different patterns of manumission, right, in terms of who would have gained manumission more, whether it was women, whether it was children, whether it was men. that gained manumission. And so you had to write. Many of these plantation owners, these slave owners, were absentee owners. So the overseer on the estate, he has to write back to Spain, Spain or back to Britain, to the owner, for that owner to write to the British government, for that person to be granted their freedom. So it's a bureaucratic and tedious process that frustrated enslaved persons who would have gained money to purchase their freedom, right? Because that was another means of getting your freedom, because sometimes the cost of manumission would shift. So you would have saved up money from getting engaged in skilled work of the plantations, doing work on the Sunday market, selling items at the Sunday market, etc., when that was instituted. But then the cost of manumission shifts, right? And of course, when it comes to convincing an absentee owner that this enslaved person is worthy of being freed, that's a different battle, because he is not tied to the enslaved person. He's looking at, he's looking at figures, he's looking at profits, right? And he's not really, doesn't really have that bond with that particular enslaved person. So all of those factors meant manumission was not always an easy thing to achieve. Well, it wasn't an easy thing to achieve. And of course, miscegenation. So you have sexual relations with a female, most times has sexual relations with a white planter. She gives birth to various children, and as a result, he decides to manumit his children, free his children, and at times free the mother of his children. Violent and non-violent resistance. You remember some of those modes of non-violent resistance in particular? Of course, we know violent resistance. Yeah. Feigning illness, looking slow. Yeah. Pretending that you don't understand what is being told to you, you don't understand the orders that are being given. Yeah. Delaying the weaning of your child off of breast milk. Yeah, all of these things were non-violent forms of resistance. Of course, contraception, practicing contraception, and other means of frustrating the planter class without engaging in rebellion, revolts, or poisoning of the planter. Yeah. Theories on the abolition of chattel slavery. We must be aware of these three theories: the humanitarian approach, William Wilberforce and various other abolitionists who were fighting for freedom in Britain, in the British Parliament, resistance by the enslaved, resistance, both violent and non-violent forms of resistance, resistance that took place from the beginning of enslavement. We must acknowledge that in various formats that were sometimes covert, but really undermined the profits of the system. At times were overt, and these are usually ones that are marked in history and easier to identify. Major rebellions, yeah, Haitian Revolution, 1816 Revolution, rebellion, sorry, 1823 rebellion, Guyana, 1831 rebellion in Jamaica, 1816 rebellion in Barbados. All of these rebellions are seen as resistance, and so all of these things would have frustrated the system, frustrated the profits of the sugar industry. And so some argue that this is primarily the reason, or major reason, for the abolition of chattel slavery. And of course, some theorists like Eric Williams, Dr. Eric Williams, claims that capitalism brought the end of enslavement. It's no longer profitable to continue with the enslavement system where persons don't have a wage to purchase items from the metropole, right? They don't have an income to support industrial capitalism that was growing and starting to flourish in Europe. Move on to Unit 5, Cuban and demographic motion, emancipation, migration, and indentureship. You remember what were the concerns after emancipation? If you were a planter, what was your concern after emancipation? Freed slaves did not desire to work on the plantations. Of course, you were abusing them for years. Why would they want to come back and work for you? But the planters hoped that the routine of habit and psychological fear of the unknown would keep the former enslaved tied to the plantation. And so we're hoping that all these years of forced dependency to an extent on the planter class will keep the former enslaved persons tied to the plantation. But they know that this may have not been the case. They also knew that they would want a wage and a reasonable wage. And so the British government instituted in the Emancipation Proclamation the apprenticeship system, right? Where you will neither bond nor free. And of course, they gave reasons for apprenticeship. And of course, that had to do largely with the fact that they didn't have large amounts of cash in the Caribbean to pay these laborers. You had free labor all the time. July 31st, 1834. 1st of August, 1834, you now have to pay a wage to all of your laborers, right, if you want them to work. So this was problematic for them. And so they introduced the apprenticeship system. Remember, you had apprenticeship regulations. Some of those regulations were 4 years for the case of non-predial apprentices working full-time, and 6 years for the case of predial apprentices, giving 8.5 hours of work for the week to their former masters. Yeah, they were supposed to be stipendiary magistrates to oversee the system, but they were biased, of course. But these were some of the regulations that you would have touched on. Reasons for its demise as well. Of course, the biasness of the stipendiary magistrates, as I just mentioned. Planters were dishonest, refusing to pay wages, yeah, many times. And when you resisted work because you weren't paid, you could face imprisonment or you could be flogged. Yeah. So those would have been some of the things we have touched on in relation to the demise of apprenticeship. And as a result, it was curtailed and prematurely 2 years early in 1838. Planter strategies post-apprenticeship, you would have touched on that as well. You have looked at the idea of wage rent. You would have looked at the idea of claiming lands as crown lands to avoid the former enslaved and former apprentices from taking to available land and growing a peasantry independent of the sugar estates, right? Giving them land at times that was far away from the plantations. By the time they had finished working for the day, they couldn't really go that distance or tend to the land, right? All of these strategies were used, yeah? And of course, when these strategies failed, many of them turned to labor schemes, right? And so we had, of course, the most successful in terms of length and in terms of number of people at the top there, indentureship. We can argue whether it was forced or free, an argument that would have been raised in your sessions. There were gender issues with Indian indentureship as well, right? Indian women were paid less than Indian men. The Indian men largely outnumbered Indian females, and all of the problems that would have arisen as a result of that, you have looked at that. Contracts, right? The way how contracts changed and fluctuated in an effort to keep the Indians here to secure labor. And the poor living and working conditions that they were under, all things that we would have covered. The idea of recruiting also Portuguese immigrants and indentured Europeans, which created a middle class kind of reality and structure that kept the masses, the persons of African descent and Indians below. Chinese immigration, which failed, and you have touched on some of the reasons for the failure of Chinese immigration. One, of course, it was expensive. And two, of course, the Chinese demanded a return passage for their laborers. And three, if I could add that one, to just help you remember, Chinese also, after their period of indenture, if they stayed, they opened their own businesses. And of course, freed Africans who were being brought from Sierra Leone. Many times the British intercepted slave ships carrying slaves to Spain and to the French colonies where slavery was still happening, even though the British had abolished their slave system, their slave trade in 1807, and they offered these freed Africans to come into their territories and work for some time. So all of these were labor schemes that we have touched on. Unit 6, we're on the last 3 units, Caribbean identity. What is identity? The individual characteristic, style, or manner that is fundamental to a person and by which a person is recognized. And so as you look to your final assignment, something with defining identity and examining identity, I feel you might be able to apply. All right, theorizing identity, Abraham Khan distinguished 2 dimensions of identity that you have touched on: the fact of identity, things that are fixed about yourself that you cannot change. You would have dealt up with that. Like, what is fixed about you that you cannot change? If you said race, that's correct. If you said sex, that's correct. Sense of identity, what are those things about yourself that are subjective that you can change? Yeah, religion, yes. If you said gender, yes. Yeah, some of those things that you would have touched on in the course as well. Woodard and F. Grace, they also had a theory for identity. They claim that it was a multi-layered concept that is a combination of social, personal, and ego identity. So you would have looked at social identity, influenced by the groups that you belong to. As you socialize, you develop these attitudes: school system, sport club that you might be a part of. Personal identity, the way you project yourself to the outside world, right? How you show yourself to the outside world. It's your personal identity, that's who you are. And of course, ego identity, our own subjective sense of knowing who we are. So what we project to persons through personal identity may not necessarily be aligned necessarily with ego identity. We may be shy, right? But because, let's say for instance, the whole issue of machoism and the male, right? He might be afraid from ego knowing about himself. He might be afraid of a frog or a snake. But if he's in the presence of females, that machoism, he is going to put on personal identity more, what he wants the world to see him as, right? As a brave person, right? As a quote unquote man, right? In that sense, right? So you would have touched on those things. Of course, you would have looked at the creolization theory and the issues with that in relation to applying it to the Caribbean region, right? When we look at creolization theory, really it's a merger of European culture with African culture. And when we use that particular theory, we exclude the many various racial groups that came into the Caribbean space, right? Thinking particularly here of the Chinese immigrants and the Indian immigrants. Yeah, how are they accounted for in the creolization theory? Yeah, but of course it has some valid points you would have touched on. Plural society theory. Yeah, we come together for economic reasons, for functional reasons, but then we go back to our separate social groups, right? Ethnic groups and ways of living. Again, that has been applied to the Caribbean. Again, I think you all would have noted that one of the issues with that, it doesn't account for the merging that occurs. Yeah, the whole idea of the quote-unquote Douglas, for instance, that example of racial integration in society. It is praised in Trinidad and Tobago in that sense, or adored perhaps to an extent in Trinidad and Tobago. In Jamaica, that term is more of a derogatory term, right? But the fact of the matter is, you have these interminglings and these levels of integration that you can't get away from. Music, chutney, soca, yeah? All of these things are integration. And so the idea of the Caribbean society being plural has a number of issues with it as well. And of course, the plantation model. Yeah, we still operate on the plantation model. Our governments have simply taken over from the European governments and modes of exploitation, whilst the masses continue to be exploited under a particular system. And that lends itself into the economy as well, and the way our economy is structured. Monocrop culture, is it still a part of the Caribbean? Yeah, do we rely heavily on one particular industry for our survival across the Caribbean? Many will argue yes. Many of these islands of the Lesser Antilles depend on tourism to give them revenue and nothing else. Trinidad and Tobago rely heavily on oil and gas and nothing else. So you have these theories that have been applied. Diaspora double consciousness. I'm sure you all should remember that. When you have left your host nation, your home nation, living in a host nation, and you have a sense of belongingness to your initial homeland. Yeah. And so Caribbean people have that sense as well when they leave the Caribbean and go to North America to live, or to go to Europe to live. Right? But they have that strong connection still to their homeland. Haiti as the first Caribbean republic. Yeah. Identity. We looked at Haiti as a symbol of freedom, that we can hope for freedom, that we can push for freedom as Caribbean people, because Haiti was successful in that sense. And so Haiti holds an important role in terms of forging a Caribbean identity, an identity of self-governance. Haiti is a pillar of that hope, and eventually that reality for Haiti and for the rest of the Caribbean. And of course, you have touched on US influences on the Caribbean. Yeah, the US in the 19th century and in the 20th century determined through various policies that you would have looked at, dollar diplomacy, yes, Monroe Doctrine, etc., where they would have attempted to see the Western Hemisphere as a region that was their duty to protect and to influence through their philosophies and their ideologies. And so these things have impacted upon the Caribbean, and even more so when we talk about cultural imperialism. Yeah, the music that, some of the music that we like and we listen to, the dress code, capitalism, right? All of these things have been influencing the Caribbean and our identity. Are we losing our identity because of US influence and power? Good question. What about our political systems? All attempts of moving away from democracy towards socialism or communist states, have the US resisted that? Yes, we can say so. Unit 7, Religion, Education, and Caribbean Family Life. I would have touched on education during enslavement, and the fact that the enslaved population did not receive an education. But education in this period, if it existed in the Caribbean, it was private tutoring or the opening up of some private schools for the children of planters and officials. Education during the post-emancipation period, we touched on the fact that it was used as a method to control the psyche of the masses and to encourage the maintenance of the status quo. Religion during encomienda and enslavement, we touched on the fact that in the encomienda system, and during that time, the clergy, who were responsible really for converting the indigenous peoples and serving the needs of European settlers, they themselves started to get involved in taking the materialism and wealth from the Caribbean and exploiting the indigenous peoples in the process. Yeah, we spoke about their role during enslavement, right? Being quiet on the issue of enslavement to a large extent, benefiting from the system of enslavement, justifying the system of enslavement. And religion in the post-emancipation period, continuing that trend of justifying the post-colonial setup, the exploitative, no, not post-colonial, post-emancipation setup. How religion was used to establish schools, to encourage to establish schools, right? To ensure that you created loyal subjects. Yeah. But of course, you take note of the development of African religions, syncretic forms, spiritual Baptists, etc. And you also took note of African expressions of Christianity, right? The Baptist Society in Jamaica, for instance. Moving away from Western attitudes towards worship, with the emergence of evangelical groups from the US in the 20th century. And of course, the African modes of worship that were practiced underground, right? Because you had legislation that impacted upon the ability to practice in the open in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. So all of these things you have touched on. Marriage as well and social acculturation in the post-emancipation period. How marriage was linked to respectability and whether marriage is still linked to respectability today. Do we look at our leaders and do we look to see if they're married or not? Or religious leaders or political leaders. And if they are not, there is some level of skepticism towards their, their ability to do their work, or somehow their moral image is tainted by the fact that they are not married, not in a nuclear family setup. Yeah, these things we inherited from the colonial system. Unit 8, penultimate unit, Caribbean Cultural Expressions, Festival, Music and Sports. A unit that I particularly enjoyed. Caribbean culture and cultural expressions are transmissible and they're always evolving. They can be transferred from one generation to the next, that's transmissible, and always evolving, always changing, of course, with time. Another unit that might be applicable to your final assignment. Body of beliefs and practices in terms, culture, this is the definition of culture. Body of beliefs and practices in terms of which a group of people understand themselves and the world and organize their individual and collective lives. It is learned through socialization and is shared by members of society. Definitely a definition of culture that you can use. Of course, you had types of culture. High culture, popular culture, subculture, counterculture. Yeah, you touch on those things. Right? The high culture, of course, refers to the cultural patterns that distinguish a society's elite. Right? Do we have persons living in the higher echelons of society in terms of their socioeconomic bracket that live a different lifestyle than everyone else? Yes. Popular culture designates cultural patterns that are widespread among a society's population. So it's popular. It's across the socioeconomic brackets and barriers, racial brackets and barriers. Are there cultural expressions that go beyond our barriers? Yes, they are. Sometimes it's in speech that go beyond the barriers, the socioeconomic barriers, right? Even though some of you might argue otherwise, and I always make that joke with students, right? When it comes to Carnival, for instance, and the celebration, does it cross socioeconomic barriers? Subculture, cultural patterns that distinguish some segment of a society's population. They involve not only difference, but also hierarchy. It distinguishes some segment of the society's population. So this might be a subgroup, right? A small group that has their own practices. It could be a very religious, conservative group that has a subculture that is very unique. Yeah, and of course, counterculture refers to cultural patterns that strongly oppose those widely accepted within a society. Counterculture rejects many of the standards of a dominant culture. Right? So this could be an immigrant group, yeah, that is living in the society, but not long enough to absorb within the popular culture. Yeah, and so they oppose this new type of living. Yeah, it could be a group for counterculture. So be mindful of those things if they apply to your question. Pure undiluted forms of culture, of course, you would have touched on that. Looked at traditional carnival as compared to the modern day mass. Looked at calypso as compared to soca. Looked at dancehall, reggae as compared to dancehall, right? It's just some of forms of culture that we would have looked at with pure, you would have looked at with pure undiluted. And of course, sports, cricket and colonialism, and how sport has been used as a unifier and a divider, but in particular, how cricket would have been used to carry the ideas of equality by the West Indies cricket team during the time of racial segregation and racial tensions in the world. And also how the West Indies Cricket Board, as it was called at that time, would have been a unifier, one of those early institutions of unity for the Caribbean. And this is why there is a call to maintain Cricket West Indies, as it is called now, right? That we must maintain institutions of unity, of Caribbean integration. Yeah? And so West Indies Cricket was one of those early institutions before CARICOM, before CSME, right? Before CARIFESTA celebrations, before CXC. Yeah? So sport was important in that sense. And now lastly, Unit 9, Caribbean Sexuality and Gender Relations, from the Victorians to Viagra. We looked at gender indigenous peoples. Remember we spoke about that, the patriarchal system? Gender in sugar societies, we spoke about that just now. Yeah, the roles of women on the estates and not getting skilled jobs on the estates, but still women dominating the domestic arena, but also working in the fields to a large extent. Gender during Indian indentureship. We made mention of the problems that persisted as a result of disproportionate number of men compared to women that worked in the indentureship scheme. In fact, women were paid less. These are things that we mentioned. Gender in the post-colonial period and how the education system was skewed towards men. Yeah, and so the men got what were taught the subjects that equipped them to work in the public and private sector, whilst women were taught subjects that domesticated them to keep them in the home. And so when we look to the leadership of the Caribbean, in terms of those who took over the reins from European control, the end of colonization, we see men at the helm of these movements. Because women were behind in relation to their exposure to education by the time many islands of the British West Indies got their independence in the 1960s, 1970s. Yeah. Dominant ideas supporting Caribbean patriarchy, conservative perspective, socialist perspective, evangelical Christian perspective. What did the conservative perspective say? Traditional society is best. Men as providers and protectors, women as homemakers and caregivers. Let men stay in the public sphere as providers and protectors. Let women stay in the private sphere as homemakers and caregivers. Socialist perspective. Dominance of economic systems dominated by men is a natural development. Do not disrupt this system as it is. This is functioning very well. This is the domain of the man. Don't try to change the system, because what you're going to have happening, children are now going to be neglected at home, because if a man is out working and the woman is out working as a professional as well, then the child is not going to get the nurturing that it needs. All right? And then so that won't benefit anybody, and it won't benefit the labor class. Evangelical Christian perspective, the belief in correctness of patriarchy in the Bible. So the Bible has particular teachings that you will learn, right? A man who doesn't provide for his home is worse than an infidel, right? Through the process of the curse on Adam and Eve after they were banished from the garden, that the man should now work to provide for his household, right? These were all influences on gender roles and the maintenance of patriarchy in the Caribbean setup. And of course, when you look at the religious groups, right, you see men at the helm. So it was also reinforced in the various religious institutions, whether Muslim, whether Hindu, or whether Christian. The Victorian era, Europe's influence on gender roles. Yeah, the rule of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. Men are naturally active workers and women sedentary. This is what it was taught. Men are victims of their passions and women are more equipped to control their desires. And so any woman who had sex before marriage was seen as forever tainted. Androcentric history and historiography of the region. And this is separate from the 2 points in the Victorian era. But the fact of the matter is, what was written about the Caribbean was written by men and it was written about men, written by men and written about men. And so that in itself poses a problem for understanding the experiences of women across Caribbean history. Influences on gender roles, we're going to touch on how the family influenced gender roles, how religion influenced gender roles, how the school impacts on gender roles, and also the impact of the media. More and more, the media is playing a role with the advent of the internet, right? But usually when I ask students, they point to the family, right, of playing a major role, and religion is playing a major role in terms of, their roles as men and women in the society and so on. Opposition to hegemonic masculinities. You have looked at the gay male perspective. Masculine feminine division breeds a culture of aggressiveness and violence, because the gay male person, is male in sex, but might have what we consider some feminine traits, right? Some feminine mannerisms, right? From what we consider the traditional mannerisms, right, or behaviors of the female. And so this idea creates an aggressiveness of violence, because persons want to know, why are you moving, as we say, like a woman? Why are you talking like a woman? Why are you acting like a woman? But really and truly, how does a woman really talk? How does a woman really act? And because of this emphasis on masculine feminine division, there has been a great level of aggressiveness towards the gay male. And the pro-feminist perspective, they believe that the society's insistence on men and boys follow certain hegemonic ideas of manhood limits the ability to function harmoniously in society with women. So, this thing about let boys be boys, etc., etc., and boys should, have be manly in a particular way, does not allow for a harmonious relationship in the society and in the home, and so on and so forth, based on the pro-feminist perspective. All right. So I hope this session was informative. I hope it was a good recap of the content of the course. I take this time to wish you all the best as you prepare for your final assignment. Please submit on time. And we just want to say that we appreciated you being here with us, tuning in to your various tutorial sessions, sharing your views passionately on all the various issues that were raised. And we do look forward to engaging with you, some of you in some meaningful ways in the future. But we do hope that even if we don't engage with you again, that you would have taken some of the things that you would have learned from the course and apply it to your life. Apply it in your homes, apply it to your places of work when you go, and apply it to your overall perspective and way of living moving forward. Appreciate the history and culture that we have here in the Caribbean. So we wish you all the best. God bless and take care.